Vertiplace is, it just describes port infrastructure for drones, and the purpose of this presentation is just to situate discussions of vertiplaces within an ongoing planning process currently unfolding in the United States. So starting in 2020, a set of 4 working groups began the next phase of scaling drone experiments into a national transportation and freight system, a stage of drone operation called Urban Air Mobility Maturity Level 4, truly a beautiful name. These working groups include the Federal Aviation Administration, NASA, and a cross-section of the aerospace industry. Monthly meetings are chaired by a representative from NASA and include the presentation of new planning documents and conclude with questions from participant specialists. In this regard, the working groups don't actively complete work, but instead serve as a communication channel signaling advanced air mobility's emerging protocols to industry. Described another way, the working groups align regulation, research and innovation, investment towards a particular design of drone mobility. So these are the 4 working groups. One might ask, how has this quasi-governmental super agency, NASA in the context of this paper, but equally CSAR in the European Union and other research complexes elsewhere, gained the mandate to orchestrate a spatial revolution? In 2012, the United States Congress passed the FAA Modernization Act, giving the FAA and NASA a directive to develop a roadmap for integrating unmanned aircraft systems, drones, into the US's national airspace system. Scaling advanced air mobility is contingent upon a radical environmental reconfiguration initiated from a top-down planning process that is changing airspace regulation, expanding modes of sensing, signaling, and automation, and proposing the construction of new physical infrastructures like vertiplaces. In its nascent stages, it exists as a series of testbed experiments, while the ultimate aim is to iteratively scale it into a national system. Germaine Haluga's survey of smart cities emphasizes the use of large infrastructure, claims for improved efficiency, and the replacement of local culture with digital culture, although yesterday we heard many examples complicating the reliance on the digital. Seen within a historical lens, the displacement of local forms of knowledge and practice is also present in past forms of scaling media infrastructures that were guided by comprehensive planning projects, whether they were territorializing land, water, or in the case of the drone, of course, the sky. The political scientist James C. Scott conceptualizes the effects of this model of top-down governance through the terms legibility, standardization, and simplification. These concepts provide analytic tools for studying the statecraft of emerging networks. Here, an important distinction is required between the scope of smart city initiatives on one hand and advanced air mobility. While smart city initiatives vary greatly between districts and municipalities, the historic role of federal oversight of power flight is requiring the creation of a nationwide standard. To do so, advanced air mobility planning and design are overseen by federal agencies. This is not to suggest a more representative process, with the purpose of the emerging framework being to direct private research, design, and investment in the construction of a new industry. A ruralist, Scott asks how centralized planning processes impose abstractions onto diverse people and places. More recently, reflecting on the expanding reach of the state, he shifts his emphasis from quasi-autonomous peoples avoiding the state to negotiating favorable terms of incorporation. And here you might think of yesterday's presentation when Hannah was discussing the resistance to the new garbage dump that had been built and was poisoning a particular group of people. In an early claim for infrastructural studies as a discipline, Paul Edwards and co-authors similarly ask how people are represented in the planning, transition, and invention of new infrastructures. Here, Winona LeDuc and Deborah Cowan make the stakes for planning infrastructure clear, stating that it has the power to provision or curtail life. They thus argue for ameliorative infrastructures that are life-giving in their design, finance, and effects. Examples that they amplify, such as renewable energy projects planned, constructed, and owned by Indigenous communities, secure greater local influence and control over the quality of everyday life. These projects are selected and championed by specific communities rather than imposed. Given the civilian nature of the advanced air mobility working groups, its facts and files are readily available, whether you're looking for them or not. Rather than a scarcity of information about the working group's focus areas and outcomes, their efforts are rendered visible through images, documents, and recordings. Given the speculative aim of the working groups, witnessing the formation of this archive, one is presented with a comprehensive planning project that is equally invested in the coordination of an industry as with methods for choreographing the flight paths of drones. Commercial drones, like past large-scale technoscientific projects, aren't discrete objects, but part of a wider reconfiguration of an environment. Scott makes this argument clear, stating that large top-down planning projects reconfigure the urban, used here not as a synonym for city, guided by a high modernist logic in pursuit of linear progress, expanding economic production, rational design of social order, growing satisfaction of a universally quantified notion of human needs, and achieving each of these goals through the expansion of scientific and technical force directed towards ordering populations and nature. Scott describes states as legibility machines, producing quantitative descriptions of populations by counting the traits of people using censuses, as seen here in this archival photograph, and along with other tools. In addition to this descriptive project, however, technoscientific planning requires making possible futures legible. Digital culture scholar Stamatia Portanova calls this type of projective legibility as governance of the present from futures that are materialized in the claims of scientists, managers, and predictive algorithms. These planning processes reflect a narrow range of professional expertise, establishing a horizon for NASA and industrial partners to evolve advanced air mobility towards. Distinguishing between the actions of states and the actions of capital, Scott notes that large-scale capitalism is just as much an agency of heroic simplification as the state is, with the difference being that for capitalists, simplification must pay. A 2018 Booz Allen Hamilton market study of urban air mobility prepared for NASA projected market values ranging from 2.5 billion US to 500 billion US. The unconstrained scenario, so 500 billion US, allowed flight at any time from any location to any destination without being hindered. This uninhibited scenario's valuation, so 500 billion, is often cited in the introduction to subsequent NASA briefs about advanced air mobility, signaling that uninhibited quality as the ultimate aim. Market studies aren't alone in creating projective legibility. Laws, presidential memorandum, pilot projects, prototypes, and test beds are fundamental to the expansion of commercial drones in the United States. Since 2015, the FAA and NASA have undertaken a series of pilot projects using test beds to prototype new forms of air traffic management, as well as to accelerate the commercialization of drones. Legibility is, of course, a descriptive practice completed by the state towards some kind of informed governance, while projective legibility is used to orient multiple actors, aligning them to the creation of a possible future. As these test beds upend historical sectional relationships, and I'm using sectional in an architectural reference to like a cut through a building. So rather than a cut through a building, a cut through airspace. US drone pilot projects also expand outwards from their initial testbed locations. You know, again, the aim being a national mobility system. Here we're seeing Griffiths Airport in Rome, New York, which is managed by a group called New Air. When it began, it was encompassed by an 8-kilometer diameter circle, and it's expanding into a 80-kilometer corridor between Rome and Syracuse that will facilitate a variety of drone experiments permissive of forms of flight that are not currently allowed. The Community Integration Working Group's stated aim is to address societal questions about scaling drone mobility. They began meeting in May 2020 with the group's shift focusing to Vertiplaces in February 2021. Since the first Vertiplace presentation, additional studies have extended the discussion to include different concepts for operation, automation, the role of software, and their locations. These planning documents are commissioned by NASA and produced by New Air. So they're commissioned out of the group at Griffiths Airport, which is why I showed it to you. These planning documents are indicative of a system engineering approach, which involves the coordination of subcontractors in the design of physical, communicative, and computational subsystems that need to work together. While it originated in military applications, perhaps beginning with the Atlas Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, 1954 to 1963. Academic engineers formalized it and spread it as a practice. Vertiplaces are projected as a system of places inserted into the existing city, suburban, and exurban fabrics. And they're constituted by a repetition of parts similar to other infrastructural systems. Working typologically, the vertiplace is the type, and the vertihubs, vertiports, and vertistops are subtypes. Each of these stations encompass different capacities, amenities, and locations in relation to existing patterns of urbanization. Intended to facilitate the movement of passengers and freight, as you can see here from these cute illustrations, the concepts remain schematic. Vertihubs and vertiports are proposed for airports or urban centers with facilities for high volume traffic, while the more remote vertistops service lower population areas. In 2018, a rideshare platform commissioned architectural firms to propose vertiplace schemes. The timeliness of that suggests an effort to influence regulatory positions rather than react. Rather than out of thin air, the Vertiplace infrastructural system is being ported onto or added onto or developed through the accretion of past ideas about flight infrastructure. Specifically looking at heliports and a 30-year-old proposal for tilt rotor plane vertiports. There are 6,000 helipads in the United States, with only 6 being available for public use. Helipads as a model operate at a much lower capacity, and they largely operate in a privatized sphere. So they don't necessarily demonstrate a great precedent for a public model of urban air mobility. Well, the tilt rotor plane never materialized as a regional transportation solution, which is kind of what you're seeing up there. Both the vehicle and its port infrastructure did receive significant planning attention. In 1991, the FAA Circular Advisory, which is a type of document that sets out regulatory standards for their design. And this document was the first one that I found to use the term vertiport. That same year, Rand Corporation completed a study for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey on the role of tilt rotor planes for alleviating the region's airspace congestion by allowing for regional flights without a need for LaGuardia, Newark's, or JFK's runways, which is just to say even unrealized infrastructural propositions contribute to a technological momentum.
I have 1 more minute.
Great. These three station types suggest a regional diagram. A recent consumer survey completed between November and January 2022 and presented at the working group investigated public perception for Vertiplaces. Suburban residents supported it the most, simply meaning to say that a consumer responsive advanced air mobility may invent a new mobility system while maintaining historical patterns of urbanization. And so towards opening this topic and concluding, I just pose a few questions for the social and spatial study of advanced air mobility. So given the aim to create a standardized and predictable national framework for drone mobility, what models, interventions, or injunctions might allow for local forms of governance to define benefits or to set limits on advanced air mobility? Following the Smart City project's imbrication with real estate development, in what ways will advanced air mobility change forthcoming models of real estate? And in what ways can national infrastructure projects like drone mobility be ameliorative infrastructure, drawing upon Leduc and Cowan? And so again, by that meaning life-giving in the planning, finance, design, and ownership of them. So thank you very much.